Hello, my name's John Tye. I'm a former Concorde pilot. I joined British Airways in the summer of 1976 as the lowest clerical grade in the airline. It was meant to be a summer holiday job before going to university. But 46 years later, I retired without a degree, but I ended up as a 777 training captain. But the highlight of my career, of course, was the 3 years I spent flying Concorde. I was one of only 134 pilots to fly Concorde for British Airways in the 27 years she was in service. She's been out of service now for 20 years. Don't we all miss her? It's great that so many of you have submitted questions through various social media channels, and I'd be delighted to address those questions today. Was it loud on Concorde, Lisa? What did you say? My ears are shot. No, it wasn't. On takeoff, if you were sitting in the rear part of the cabin, close to those 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines with the reheat on, yes, it was noisy, but you could still talk. And once we were airborne and the reheats were deselected, passengers would sit there and quite comfortably have normal conversation. Now, in the flight deck, during takeoff, it was quite noisy, but not significantly worse than a 747 or a subsonic aeroplane of the era. Once we accelerated above 250 knots, we raised the nose and the visor, the heat shield in front of us. And I'm sure you've seen Concorde then adopts a very sleek, streamlined profile. And the noise levels dropped enormously. You could sit there in your shirt sleeves and have a very normal conversation in normal voices, flying at twice the speed of sound. Absolutely incredible. Edward, that's a really good question. Concorde flew through the sound barrier twice a day at least for 27 years, an absolutely unbelievable technical achievement. You felt nothing. In the flight deck, you saw the needle on the vertical speed indicator, the VSI, oscillate as the shock wave moved rearwards. In the cabin, nothing at all. All the passengers would have felt was 2 nudges in the back, because to go through the sound barrier, of course, we needed full power and reheat. And the reheats would be selected in pairs, the inboards and then the outboards. And as each was selected, you get a nudge with the increase of power. So that's what the passengers felt. I remember landing back at the end of a charter flight one day, and this happened several times, and a passenger said to me, "John, that was a bit disappointing. There was nothing exciting about going supersonic." And I said, "Sir, that's the whole point. That's the clever bit. That's what it's all about." We always use full power with reheat, so the acceleration was absolutely phenomenal. We would use a form of words to explain that to the passengers before we took off, so they knew that they were going to be pushed into the back of their seats. But then after takeoff, when we reached the critical noise abatement point, where we would cut the power back, having turned the reheats off, it would suddenly go really quiet and you'd lose that kick in the back that you'd had. So it actually gave you a bit of a sinking feeling. So if you weren't prepared for that, that would feel quite strange. So we'd warn the passengers about the acceleration, being pushed back into the seat, and then how it would fade. Now on landing, that was also a spectacular maneuver. We would always use full brakes, carbon fiber brakes, the first fitted to a civilian aeroplane, and full reverse thrust. So the deceleration on landing was just as exciting as the takeoff. And nowadays, if we were flying Concorde, we'd end up with 100 iPhones in the flight deck on landing, I'm sure, because the deceleration was phenomenal. As for air sickness and turbulence, no. There was never any turbulence on Concorde. She was such a slim, streamlined aeroplane, and we were flying above all the weather systems. I never used the seatbelt sign once, apart from takeoff or landing. I think my most memorable flight, Claire, must have been my very first one. The very first day I flew Concorde for the first time. It was in Seville under training, and Concorde had never been to Seville before. We arrived there and thousands of people came out to watch us. We were doing our base trainings, we call it, our circuits and bumps, and it was February 1999. And my very first takeoff was just before sunset. It was absolutely mind-blowing. We just flew one circuit and came round and landed because the sun was setting and we had to stop. I'll never forget that day, one of the best days of my life. It was also in at the deep end as to what a high-profile role the job of a Concorde pilot was. I'd just flown Concorde for the very first time. I was gathering my thoughts and getting ready to get off the aeroplane. And Mike Bannister came in with a TV crew, and I was interviewed live on Spanish television about what it was like to fly Concorde for the first time. I'll never forget that day. Roughly, I did 3 years on flying Concorde. I must have done something like over 500 supersonic hours, of course. So roughly 4,000 miles per trip. So it must be 200,000 miles, something like that. Concorde was a delight to fly. The people that designed and developed this aeroplane were absolutely fantastic. She was easy to fly. We had automatic stabilization assistance systems. It was a fly-by-wire aeroplane. So the fact that you could actually take off and fly, I did this regularly, take off from New York, accelerate and hand fly Concorde through the sound barrier all the way to Mach 2. I did it regularly out of New York. That's absolutely incredible. Handling characteristics, just very light and gentle. As we went through the sound barrier and the shock wave moved rearwards, she just get very light on the controls, but perfectly flyable. Landing in bad weather, not a problem at all. She actually had an auto land system. So if it was foggy, as it often could be in London or New York, of course, we could do full category 3, they're called, auto lands in foggy conditions. Crosswinds, not a problem. Because she was long and thin and a very powerful rudder, we could cope with crosswinds, I think up to 40 knots off the top of my head. Certainly not a problem. Flying into the flare was very different from a conventional aeroplane. As you get close to the ground, Concorde's big delta wing squeezes the air between the runway and the wing itself. And that tends to slow down your rate of descent, which is exactly what you want to be doing. You're coming down the approach probably at 160 knots or so, the last little bit. So your rate of descent is about 800 feet a minute. As you go into the flare, you need to reduce that rate of descent. And that would happen naturally in this ground effect by squeezing the air between the wing and the ground. What that would do as well is tend to tip the nose forward on Concorde. So given all that, the maneuver, what we actually did inside the cockpit in the aeroplane was very similar to that of a conventional aeroplane, but for different reasons. So at 15 feet, we'd close the throttles, get rid of the power, and we would gently pull back on the control column, not to raise the nose as you would do on a conventional aeroplane, but to stop it from dropping and to maintain that constant attitude of 10.5 degrees all the way down to touchdown. So similar physical movements, but for different reasons. Flying supersonically was a crucial operation, of course. The flight engineer was very busy. There were some failures, hydraulics or engines, which meant we had to decelerate and descend quite quickly. The flight engineer would be very busy. The procedure is different depending on the scenario, but basically we would have to decelerate and descend quite quickly. During the acceleration through the sound barrier, of course, we've moved all the fuel, or a lot of fuel, up to 10 tons of it, rearwards into tank 11 to adjust the center of gravity for supersonic flight. If we suddenly have to decelerate and descend, we need to move that fuel back forward. If the flight engineer was too busy to do that because he was involved in handling whatever problem had occurred, then above my head, we had a big red guarded emergency use only fuel forward transfer switch. So I would hit that switch and it would bring all the fuel back forward again to bring the center of gravity forward so we could safely and quickly decelerate back to subsonic flying. As far as emergency descent was concerned, this is a procedure that any aeroplane has to be able to fly, having suffered a rapid loss of pressurization. So up at 60,000 feet, of course, we're that much higher. And this is the reason Concorde has small windows. So the airplane had to be certified to suffer, I believe, not just one, two window failures. So the air would all go rushing out of the airplane. And we would then close the throttles, descend immediately, and during that descent, we would become subsonic.
Did you ever have to enact any of those emergency procedures?
No, the aeroplane was so reliable. I do know there were incidents during the aircraft's 27 years in service that hydraulics and engine intake failures and that kind of thing, which did necessitate a fairly rapid deceleration to below Mach 1. And that would result in a diversion very often to another airfield. As far as I know, we never flew any emergency descents. We never suffered window failures and never had to fly an emergency descent due to depressurization. On board Concorde, we had sophisticated navigation equipment. Bearing in mind this was an airplane that first flew in 1969 and went into service in 76, we had 3 inertial navigation systems, INSs. They were all linked and could talk to one another, and we would program them with the first 9 waypoints, and that would cover the first part of the flight. And it was very important we remembered before we got to number 9 to reload the INSs with the next waypoints, otherwise we would have turned around and gone back to where we started from. So very sophisticated navigation, inertial navigation systems. That's a really good question. So conventional subsonic aeroplanes follow North Atlantic tracks. They change every day depending on the wind patterns over the Atlantic. So the wind generally blows from the west, so a subsonic airliner will try and avoid the winds when flying from UK or Europe to United States. And they would try and ride with the winds to get the tailwinds coming back. Concorde was above all the weather. We were up at 60,000 feet. We hardly ever saw the jet streams, the strong winds over the ocean. We were above them. And even if we did have a headwind at 1,350 miles an hour, it was going to have little effect on our speed across the ocean. So we had fixed tracks, supersonic tracks fixed throughout the whole of Concorde's operation across the Atlantic. Westbound and eastbound with separate tracks, and they were fixed. Paul, that's a good one. Concorde, of course, was stocked with the finest wines, spirits, gins, and food. As far as I know, we never ran out of anything. Towards the end of Concorde's operation, of course, the airplane was full. Everybody wanted everything, so there might have been a few shortages. The finest champagne was served on board Concorde for the passengers, of course. When I started flying, the cabin crew would come in about half an hour after takeoff with 3 mugs of tea, which all went down very well. We had cup holders next to us. But what surprised me was that to accompany that, there was very often 3 pots of the finest caviar left over from the passenger service, of course. And it was a tough day at work if we didn't get tea and caviar around about 11 o'clock every morning. Duncan, when we took off in the spring or the autumn, it was dark in the evening. We'd leave Heathrow at 7 o'clock and head west. We'd soon be flying at twice the speed of sound, faster than the Earth is rotating. So we would see the sunrise in the west. So that was one of the most spectacular sights any human could have in an aeroplane and won't be seen again. As to my favourite destination, I've got to say Barbados. I'd leave home having had breakfast. I'd drive to Heathrow and do all my pre-flight preparations. We'd leave Heathrow at 9:30 on a Saturday morning, get served breakfast as we flew across the Atlantic at twice the speed of sound. So having left at 9:30, we touched down in Barbados at 8:30 in the morning, just in time for breakfast. Sharon, there are a lot I'm sure you've seen in the Concorde flight deck. As you went in, the first thing you saw on the right was the flight engineers panel, a most complex array of switches, dials, and valves, and all lights as well. And then at the front, of course, we had the pilot's instrument panels. Now, as a first officer on Concorde, and the captain as well, of course, but I had to know how the flight engineers panel worked as well. There was only one flight engineer, so if anything happened to him, it would have been my responsibility to go and sit in his seat and work that panel there. It was a most complex fuel management system, for example, and I nearly quit the course on day 1 when they told me that Concorde had 13 fuel tanks and they're numbered 1 to 11. I did know what every switch, knob and dial did in that flight deck. And if you took me in there now, I could probably still remember what most of them do. The training course on Concorde was so intense, you had to switch off from everything else in your life. We would drive to Filton on a Sunday night and spend all week there doing the ground school or the simulator course, and then come home on the Friday evening for a weekend off. Much of that weekend, of course, was spent revising or studying for the next part of the training course. So it really was just intense and certainly not wrapped around anything else you were doing in your life whatsoever. Well, let's talk about flying in mechanical signalling first of all. Concorde, of course, was the first fly-by-wire airliner, absolutely groundbreaking technology. We had two electrical systems that powered all the flight controls. And if you get to look in a cockpit of Concorde, you can see the instruments just in front of the co-pilot's knee. And on there, it shows the flight control surfaces, the elevons and the rudders. And they're powered normally by green or blue signaling. And if either of those failed, then we did have a manual backup. And we did practice flying it in manual backup in the simulator. And it was slightly agricultural, a little bit clumsy, but perfectly flyable. We never flew the aeroplane in mechanical backup. The test pilots and the pilots carrying out air tests even in British Airways service each year on the aeroplanes did fly the aeroplane in mechanical backup. So it's a little heavier on the controls and a little bit more mechanical. Hi, Adam. Yeah, we can often find that out for you. If you email flyconcorde@brooklandsmuseum.com, we have a way of communicating amongst the small Concorde family that it is, of course, and people can look in their logbooks or look that up for you. So do get in touch. Flying Concorde at 60,000 feet on the edge of space, where you can see the curvature of the Earth and the sky is black above you, is absolutely phenomenal every day. But one particular thing which was so special was taking off from Heathrow in the autumn or the spring on the evening 003 service to New York. It was dark. We soon accelerate through the sound barrier on up to 1,350 miles an hour. We're flying faster than the Earth is rotating. So we see the sunrise in the west. We get our sunglasses out again. And then we fly into the afternoon and land in New York. And as we're driving into Manhattan, see a second sunset of the day. That will not be seen again. Hi, Andy. Yes, I did. We all sat at home for about 3 months or so on gardening leave. My garden never looked better. And then it depended on where we were in the airline, our seniority and our age. A lot of the Concorde captains went back to the 747, which is what many of them had flown before. So that was a fairly easy transition. A lot of them, of course, were close to retirement anyway, so they didn't fly again. And some of us who were perhaps a bit younger and first officers used the opportunity to get our commands on short-haul aeroplanes. So a mixture. That's really interesting. So I came off Concorde in the year 2000, of course, and sat at home for quite a while. And then I was given the opportunity to train to become a captain on the Airbus. So it was a really challenging training course. I'd never flown an aeroplane with a glass cockpit. I'd never flown an aeroplane without a flight engineer looking after me. And I'd never flown around Europe apart from my time in Dan Air flying the 727 on charter flights. So it was very, very different. A, changing to the left-hand seat to get my command. B, flying with a side stick instead of a big control column. And the main thing I noticed was it was so much slower. At Concorde, we'd been going everywhere at twice the speed of sound, of course. And it seemed to take ages to get anywhere in a conventional airline. That's a really good question, Elvis. And to be honest with you, I don't know, but it's always been there since Concorde first flew way back in 1969. It's because takeoff on Concorde is such a precise maneuver that all three flight crew members, the captain, the first officer, and the flight engineer, all start their stopwatches simultaneously. The noise abatement procedure in particular is predicated on a timing to the second. So after takeoff, it's 3, 2, 1, noise, and the power gets cut right back. Funny you should ask that, Neil. On my last flight in British Airways when I retired back in December 22 on the Boeing 777, I was walking around the first class cabin, as I often do, chatting to the passengers. And we were reminiscing. I made no secret of the fact it was my last ever flight after 46 years in aviation. And one of the passengers, totally out of the blue, asked exactly that. When's the book coming out? Well, it is coming out. And I've spent 3 years writing it. And this is it. It's about my life. The clue's in the title. I started off with nothing in life, not even parents. So I have written a book, and I hope you find it inspiring, moving, and at times amusing. Stephanie, yes, it will. I know it's out there on Amazon and in Waterstones and various other places already, and it's going to be in the museum shop at Brooklands.